So we come back then to 1 Timothy chapter 5. Very much thinking about honour actually in God's household. Honouring God's household. Now, the pandemic isn't exactly over, that's for sure. It's not really over in this country, no matter what comes up in the news tomorrow, or even around the world. Having said that, it's been going on long enough for us to have learned quite a lot of lessons about what's gone on in society, what's been going on in church. And one of the many observations about church, and churches in general across, certainly across the West, is that people don't often regard the local church in the same way that Jesus does. And which isn't a new thing. But the pandemic really has kind of highlighted that and amplified people's response to church, where some who were kind of just attenders, some of those have drifted away, and other people have become more engaged and realised, actually, no, this is really important. Of all the things that are moving and changing in the world, this is a rock that I can stand on. 1 Timothy 5 helps put us all back a bit more on track and helps us understand actually how does God see the church, and what does it mean to be in God's household. And part of that is how we look after one another. So to begin with, we've got care for the vulnerable within the church. Care for the vulnerable within. In the first 16 verses he talks about these things. Because there's one controlling thought that runs through the verses that we read, and it's the fact that we are God's household. We're God's household. In chapter 3, we read the household of God. This is the church of the living God. The household of God, this is the church of the living God. And then as we come to these chapter 5, we have Paul referring to different people in that household. You know, in every household you have older people, younger people, kids and grandkids and whatever it may be. And so remembering that Timothy himself is a younger man, okay? He gets these instructions in the first couple of verses about how he's to be with older men, older women, women, younger men. So he's a younger man. Never speak harshly to an older man, but appeal to him respectfully as you would to your own father, like as if he's speaking in his own family. So this whole mindset of how you relate to other people is connected to the fact that we are actually the household of God. Treat older women as you would your mother. Treat younger women with all purity as you would your own sisters. It's that household that is to remember. And so what you then come to is these three specific situations that deal with relationships within the church. And you remember that, of course, the Bible wasn't written in English, it was written in Greek, and different translations, different English translations will pick up on slightly different things, because there's no such thing as a perfect translation, it's a different language. The ESV that we haven't got here, the ESV picks up on a particular word that shows how they're connected, which is honouring. So he first talks about how you're to honour widows, then he'll talk about how we honour elders, and then how Christian slaves are meant to honour their Christian masters in the first couple of verses of chapter 6. So it begins with widows. In verses 3 to 16, how we're to take care of, as the NLT puts it there, to provide for, different translations, to honour. Why widows then? Of all the people in the church, why is he particularly emphasising widows? Well, in the ancient world, a widow had a particular vulnerability in society. She'd typically have no income in a world that would be dominated, in marketplaces that would be dominated by men. SGA the other day were asking for prayer for people in Eastern Europe and further east. And in particular, they were asking prayer for the widows in those cultures because there are simply no protections for them. No financial help, no financial aid, and there are mission organisations trying to help them. And that was very much the situation that Paul is writing into there at Ephesus. There's no one helping these vulnerable women. But at the same time, we do need to recognise that the Bible actually shows the emphasis of God's care for the vulnerable. And over, as you read through the Bible, you will find how God actually establishes laws for the protection of vulnerable people, like orphans, like immigrants, like widows. So this is a reflection of God's own care. So a true widow who is truly alone in this world has placed her hope in God. She prays night and day, asking God for his help. He cares about the prayers of widows. He cares about the prayers of any vulnerable person, whatever that has caused that vulnerability. And because God cares for such people, his church must care for such people. They must matter. So when he talks about honouring them or caring for them or take care of them, verse 3, he's talking about supporting them financially. In a world where a widow has no money, the church is to support her. But at the same time, there are limits, and the church doesn't have an unlimited amount of money, So in the first place, he says, look, the church might not actually be the only option. That might not even be the best option. So verse 4, if she has children or grandchildren, their first responsibility is to show godliness at home and repay their parents by taking care of them. This is something that pleases God. Now, we were looking at godliness, weren't we, last time? It's something that you can grow in and train for. But it's active, and here's an active example, a very practical thing. And so specifically, a godly son or a godly daughter will care for his or her parents in their old age. Honour your father and mother. It's a basic command, and here's an opportunity to do it in their old age. And that also means then the resources of the church, which are to be applied to those people who are truly alone, can be best used. So you see how there's a very practical, godly wisdom to all of this. The church was then to have a list of women that they would support regularly. And the church is the household of God, is actually the widow's family. Where there's no blood relatives to provide for her, the church, as the household of God, is the widow's family. And so these aren't kind of general instructions to pray for the poor in society, that they're very much specifically about church. The Bible has plenty to say, obviously, about care for others as well. So he's writing very specifically about the relationships within the church. So it's not meant to be exclusive. But certainly the family aspect should be very, very strong in how we care for one another. Well, who then? How does he decide who goes on the list? If we're going to have this list of women, well, verses 9 and 10, he says, a widow who is put on the list for support must be a woman who's at least 60 years old, who is faithful to her husband. She must be well respected by everyone because of the good she has done. Has she brought up her children well? Has she been kind to strangers and served other believers humbly? Has she helped those who are in trouble? Has she always been ready to do good? Not as a kind of core tick, 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 but more, what kind of person is she? And you think, well, wait a minute, does she have to earn her place then? Does a woman have to earn her place to receive good things from the church? Well, remember, this is very much about people within the church. This isn't about trying to work out how we care for people generally in society. This is very specific about people in the church. So, and the church has been told how to look after its own. So how you need to think about, is a woman coming to your meeting actually one of you, or is she taking you for a ride? There's a godly wisdom to it. So you're to look for evidence that woman actually is a Christian. She is a child of God. And if she's a child of God, she's in the household of God, and you're to care for her. That's what those questions are about. And the church equally doesn't want to be seen actually to be funding someone whose lifestyle just doesn't fit with this good news of Christ. So the widow who lives only for pleasure is spiritually dead even while she lives, and the church isn't going to fund that, because that would actually weaken the message of the church. And then in verses 11 to 15, I don't know what you've made of those when we read through them, Paul says younger widows shouldn't be put on the list, they're better off marrying. And at that point you think, well, that's a bit odd. Well, verse 15 makes it clear that there were some specific women in Ephesus who really were going off the rails. And there's no suggestion that a paragraph like that would apply to all women or all young widows. I mean, clearly not. So he's writing into a specific problem there in Ephesus. But the principle is absolutely clear. The financial support isn't a free ride for a godless life, however old you are. And then the whole thing gets summarized again in verse 16. If a woman who's a believer has relatives who are widows, she must take care of them and not put the responsibility on the church. Then the church can care for the widows who are truly alone. Okay, great. But you think, we're not in first century Ephesus. And frankly, we're not even in the situation that SGA were asking us to pray about the other day. And in the UK, we typically don't have the same financial vulnerabilities that a passage like this would cause us to turn to. And when I say that, I'm not diminishing in any way the difficulty of simply getting by as our fuel prices continue to rise and pensions are very thin. We recognise that life can be hard, but not quite as hard as having nothing, as many widows around the world still suffer with. But it should be clear, the principle is clear, that God cares for the vulnerable, the weak, and his church should care for the vulnerable, the weak, especially those within. And even the best off, the most financially secure widow amongst us might be starved of company, of love, of companionship. There's always emotional and spiritual vulnerability. There's always loneliness, maybe the most lonely. Now, if you still have your parents, you probably still go and visit them. It's something that is natural for us. We go and visit our families, don't we? And the church, as the household of God, is a widow's family where she has no other family, where there are no other blood relatives to provide. And so we see our own godliness, or even the lack of our godliness, expressed in our care for the vulnerable within. So, as you visit family, it should be natural for us to visit church family. We shouldn't need to be told and encouraged to visit church family. It should be a normal thing, because you visit your own family, no one asks you to. You might even do it for the kind of elements of your family that you might, prefer not to see too often, but they're family, What do? You phone them up, you drop off some flowers, do a bit of shopping, do anything for family. The thought of practical care for those vulnerable in God's household isn't even limited, of course, simply to widows, but to everybody who's vulnerable in any way. And the only reason that Paul is picking up this particular topic here is because that was a pressing issue in Ephesus. But it's about principles. It's about caring for the vulnerable people in our families. So it applies to orphans, asylum seekers, the unemployed, immigrants, anybody who has any kind of need. Because if you're a Christian, you don't just attend church, you are church. Alan's going for some fresh air, I think. Yeah. Super. A prime example of how we care for one another. If the church feels like home to you, make sure you welcome people into your home. And it should feel like home to others. We're not an exclusive club. We want others to be joined into this family. Truth, we saw last time, leads to godliness. And godliness then proves the truth. The truth says, as you come to know Christ, your life will be transformed and his love will live in you. So Paul switches to another topic. He talks now about, rather than simply showing honour, moves to double honour. Verses 17 to 15. Double honour to paid elders. Let me read verses 17 and 18. Elders who do their work well should be respected and paid well, especially those who work hard at both preaching and teaching. For the scripture says you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain, and in another place, those who work deserve their pay. Actually quoting scripture there from New Testament. That phrase, should be respected and paid well, is literally worthy of double honour. Remember I said there was that the thing that joins these things together is showing honour to people. And so here, and in the relation to the widows, that part of that showing honour was a financial contribution, a financial aid. And so what he's talking about, showing paid pastors and elders double honour. If you want to double my wages, that's great. I won't stop you, but that's not what he's actually talking about. Unfortunately for me, that's not what he's talking about. But there are two degrees, two kinds of honour that are to be shown to a pastor, to a paid elder, to somebody who's employed by a church to do this kind of work. And the first is about his wage, and clearly to be paid an appropriate wage. And you think, okay, well, what's an appropriate wage? Well, typically we want our pastors to be trained, don't we? Actually well trained, to be university trained or college trained. We want them to be able to teach. We want them to be able to lead, which means they need a certain amount of life experience, typically a certain amount of spiritual giftedness. We also then expect these men to be available to us in our time of need. And we all have that time of need, a point where we need to pick up the phone and say, can you come to the hospital with me? And whatever time of day or night, whatever day of week, we expect that to be available. And they're to be sacrificial, they're to be devoted to the work and give themselves wholeheartedly. And what do we then pay that? Well, there's no sphere of work where we'd expect somebody of that caliber to do that kind of work for a salary that is less than a teacher or a labourer. And so it's not right for the church to do that either. And you think, well, okay, well, what if the church can't afford an appropriate wage if we need to think in that way? Well, they could offer a lower wage, but that doesn't really kind of fit. That's hardly double honour. There are many churches that have part-time pastors who have other jobs, tent maker pastors as they're sometimes called. They'll work part of the week for the church and part in a secular job simply to make up their salary. Jim Waterworth did that for years at Irby, for example. However, it's thought that there is an element of faith in future grace, where funds don't always match. There's an anticipation of future grace, and so there's an obedience and a faith element to it. And you think, okay, well, why is he even talking about pastors here? You know, he's been talking about widows. Why does he make this sudden switch to talking about paid elders and pastors? Because actually, a pastor, a paid elder, is in a similar situation in one way to the widow. So verse 5, a widow, a woman who is truly alone in this world, has placed her hope in God. She prays night and day, asking God for his help. See, she depends on God because that's the situation she's in. A pastor does the same. Well, because he's appointed by Jesus. Christ took me, for example, as he takes many pastors, from financial security, if you can call it security. If working for Christ is quite secure, actually. But it takes you from the apparent financial security of a secular job, a well-paid secular job, and he says, I want you to be pastor there. And you say, okay, Lord, I'm trusting you to make this work. I don't know how it's going to work. I'm trusting you to put food on the table. And for me personally, that's then an act of faith and obedience. I'm trusting the Lord this is what he's chosen to do. And I'm going to be obedient to what the direction he's pointing me in. And so for you as church, you're giving and you pay my salary, of course. And that and paying an appropriate wage is also an act of faith and obedience. But that's only the first part. The salary part, the pay part, is only part of double honour. There's the other half of this double honour that's to be given. And in verses 19 to 21, he highlights the importance to Timothy. Look, you're not to appoint or remove an elder lightly. Why? Because they're appointed by Christ. You're not hiring and firing a consultant or a handyman. That's a bit of a rubbish job. That was a rubbish sermon. Let's get the next guy. He's the under-shepherd of Christ. Christ is the great shepherd. And you, as all of us come under the sound of a pastor, he's Christ's under-shepherd. Which means he's to be protected from spurious claims, spurious, ridiculous charges against him, because the devil will try to bring down the church leader and undermine the gospel. But he's also then to be held accountable for his sin. This is the honour bit. On the one hand, protect him from stupid, spurious comments. But if the man sins, that really does undermine the gospel, doesn't it? That really does undermine the message of grace. And so he's to be held responsible and accountable, and then to stand up and be brought before the church and say, this man has sinned. Because sin is sin, no matter who does it. So the second part of this double honour is about providing appropriate levels of protection and accountability. Because the stakes are too high. Not to. Because people all around us are sleepwalking into hell. They're just drifting into hell every day. And you and I, as his church, we're pillars of the truth. We're meant to hold that truth up. And our lifestyle, our godliness is a core element in that. If we just look like the world, we don't have much of a message, do we? The truth is that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, and God wants everyone to be saved. It's a funny chapter in some ways. Verse 23 is a really strange personal aside. Don't drink only water. You ought to drink a little wine for the sake of your stomach because you're sick so often. I've seen it said, well, he wasn't actually to drink wine. He was just meant to rub it on his tummy. It's like, come on. We're obviously to be above reproach. Never to be drunk. The Bible's absolutely clear on that. The Bible never actually prohibits alcohol, but it certainly says don't get drunk. Because you're not ready for Christ if you are. You're not exhibiting his goodness. For all that, though, it's still unusual to see it recommended to drink alcohol, but the recommendation there is clearly, obviously medicinal, genuinely medicinal. And I think Sam has enjoyed one or two medicinal tipples while he's been in hospital, so that's really nice. And it may be actually that somebody has seen Timothy drinking wine and actually begun to bring a spurious charge against him. Well, yeah, you should see him knocking it back. He's got a hip flask and everything. Maybe. But clearly, look, there's nothing wrong with a little medicinal, but certainly never ever get drunk. Not given to much wine was one of the core requirements. And because sooner or later, all leaders, everybody, both good and bad, their evil and their good, will come out. It will be known. It becomes obvious. Remember, the sins of some people are obvious, leading them to certain judgment, but there are others whose sins will not be revealed until later, but they will be revealed. In the same way, the good deeds of some people are obvious, and the good deeds done in secret will someday come to light. So then he comes into chapter 6, these just 2 verses at the start of chapter 6. We're God's household, we're God's family, we provide for those in our family that we have an obligation towards, whether that's widows and other vulnerable people, and our Christ-appointed elders and leaders and pastors. Anybody who depends solely on the Lord for income, he does that through his people. So this last example of honouring is another really lovely example of how being a Christian changes your perspective on the situation that you're in. All slaves should show full respect for their masters, and so they will not bring shame on the name of God and his teaching. If the masters are believers, that's no excuse for being disrespectful. Those slaves should work all the harder because their efforts are helping other believers who are well loved. Now in that, he's not saying that slavery is a good thing. And certainly even there, the slavery systems that were in place at that time would be different from what comes to mind when we think of slavery and the shame of our own culture. He's not talking about that kind of slavery. What he is saying, in fact, is that whatever system you're in, you're to conduct yourself well. So as a Christian slave, don't bring the gospel into disrepute by poor workmanship. Actually, this is an opportunity to work all the better. And if a Christian slave has a Christian master, well, actually, I go to church with him, I call him Dave in church. I don't call him master, I do that one. And so it's a bit more relaxed, isn't it? No, says Paul. Actually, this is an opportunity for you to glorify Christ. Because by serving your Christian master, your boss, whatever it is, you're honouring them, you're helping them, you're benefiting them. Whereas a master normally has to look after his slave, you can look after your master. You're kind of turning the tables. You're having a different perspective. In Romans 12, Paul tells the church even to outdo one another in honouring one another. It's probably the only place in the Bible where believers are meant to kind of be in competition with one another. Oh, I can love you better than you can love me. Well, no, let me see about that. That'd be a good competition, wouldn't it? There's no room for one-upmanship. There's no room for competing in anything else except this one thing of delighting to honour one another, to help one another, to be the best at encouraging and building one another up. So what do you have? Lots of this is actually about principles. There's a specific situation going on in Ephesus. There are principles that we can lift. He's reorienting your thinking about church and what it means. A church isn't somebody, a Christian isn't somebody who just attends church, who does lots of helpful, nice things for charity. A Christian's a forgiven sinner. Christ Jesus came into the world to forgive sins. And that's what you are, all of us. And then as you turn from your sin, you ask God for forgiveness, he will forgive you. He's promised to. And then you become a child of God. It's not simply you're not going to hell, you're going to heaven. You become a child of God. Which means as you gather with his people, we're his family. It's a family reunion. We have that oneness. He's our Father. Jesus is your brother. His Father is your Father. So a local church like this isn't just like a family. Oh, I love going to church, it's like a family. No, it is a family. We have one Father. And that's an astonishing blessing. It means that going to church on a Sunday, gathering in this way, shouldn't be odd or any kind of chore or hardship. It's as natural and as lovely as visiting your family. A family reunion every week. Normally we only get to do these things at funerals as you get older. As you care for your own family, your Father expects you to care for your church family, his other adopted children. So what do you expect of us? Which means that you are family to the single person amongst us. You are family to the widow amongst us, or the widower. You're family to the one who will never marry. Your family to the rich, your family to the skint, your family to the happy, family to the broken-hearted. Families eat together. Let's eat together. At the very least, stop and have a coffee at the end and have a chat and just say hello. Families aren't perfect. Churches aren't perfect, you know. You've heard it a million times. If you find a perfect church, move on because you'll spoil it. There is no perfect church. There's no perfect family. Our Father in heaven, he's perfect. And he works in us. And through this, actually for us to grow in godliness together. We'll do the best that we can to be the kind of family that our Father delights in. A family where people can see the truth of Christ worked out as we love one another. And in practical godliness. So be church. Be family. Be his household. Our collective witness rides on it. It's really important because people are drifting into hell and the stakes, frankly, couldn't be higher.